Daniel Cole and Margaret Fields were never supposed to meet. One was a man found dead in the woods in 2023, the other a woman who vanished without a trace in 1996. Yet a single photograph proved they stood side by side, smiling, decades apart. And the truth behind it would shatter everything you think you know about time, identity, and murder. Pine Hollow was the kind of place that didn't make the news. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was a small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The main street was lined with family-owned shops, and on weekends, neighbors gathered at the diner for coffee and gossip. Crime was almost unheard of, occasional petty thefts, maybe a few traffic violations, but nothing serious. That's why, on a frosty winter morning, the discovery shocked the entire community. It was just after sunrise when a local jogger decided to take his usual route through the wooded trail at the edge of town. The ground crunched beneath his sneakers, the air sharp with the smell of pine. He didn't notice anything unusual at first, just the usual quiet broken by birdsong. Then, a few steps off the trail, he saw something that made him stop in his tracks. Lying among the fallen leaves was a man. His clothing stood out immediately, an expensive suit and polished shoes, completely out of place in the damp forest. The jogger's first thought was that the man had passed out or was injured, but as he stepped closer, he realized there was no movement. The skin was pale, the chest still. It took only a moment to notice the brutal injuries to the man's face, the kind that made him turn away. Heart pounding, the jogger stumbled back to the trail and pulled out his phone, calling the police with shaking hands. Within minutes, the peaceful woods were swarming with flashing lights and officers carefully marking the scene. Word spread fast in Pine Hollow, and by the time the sun had fully risen, everyone knew. The quiet town had just become the setting of a crime that would change it forever. The investigation moved quickly once the body was transported to the county morgue. Fingerprint analysis gave the man a name: Daniel Cole, age 42, a respected investment banker from the city nearly 50 miles away. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Daniel had no relatives, property, or business ties in Pine Hollow. No one in town recognized him, and there were no hotel bookings or rental car records that placed him there. When detectives contacted his family, the shock was immediate. His wife explained that Daniel had left for work 3 days earlier and never returned. At first, she assumed he was tied up in meetings or traveling for business without notice, something that happened occasionally in his demanding career. But when he didn't come home by the second night and failed to answer calls, she reported him missing. Colleagues described him as punctual, organized, and calm under pressure, the kind of man who kept his life in strict order. Yet, in the week before his disappearance, some noticed a shift in his behavior. He had seemed distracted, often glancing over his shoulder, and left the office early on more than one occasion without explanation. None of his coworkers could recall him mentioning Pine Hollow or anyone who lived there. Detectives searched his home and office for clues. His desk was immaculate, with neatly arranged files and no sign of disorder. His personal computer showed no unusual activity, and his phone records revealed no calls or texts linked to Pine Hollow. It was as though he had simply appeared in the woods out of nowhere. The lack of any clear reason for him to be there turned the case into a mystery from the start, one that hinted at a story far stranger than anyone in Pine Hollow could imagine. As investigators combed the scene, they were meticulous in documenting every small detail. The man's suit was tailored and freshly pressed, despite the damp forest floor. His watch, an expensive silver model, still ticked on his wrist. There was no wallet, no phone, no identification, nothing that would normally help explain his presence. But in the inner pocket of his suit jacket, a single object stood out, a small brass key. It was old, tarnished in places, with scratches that suggested years of use. Unlike modern keys, it was heavy, with a rounded bow and teeth cut in an unusual pattern. Etched faintly along one side was the number 16. It didn't resemble any house or car key the officers had seen. Its design felt out of place, as though it belonged to something from another era. The key was carefully bagged as evidence, its potential importance immediately clear. If it led to a location, it might hold the answer to why Daniel Cole had been in Pine Hollow, or who had brought him there. For now, though, it was only a clue without context, another piece in a puzzle with no visible edges. The surrounding area offered little else. No tire tracks, no cigarette butts, no footprints beyond the joggers and the responding officers. The only disturbances were the flattened leaves where Daniel's body had been found. It was as if he had been placed there deliberately, in a spot just far enough from the trail to remain hidden. The brass key soon became the focal point of speculation. Was it a link to a secret property, a hidden safe, or something far stranger? No one knew yet. But in a case where nothing seemed to fit, that single, mysterious object felt like it might unlock the first real lead. The search into Daniel Cole's past began with routine checks, financial records, travel history, and personal contacts. At first glance, his life appeared ordinary for a man in his position. He owned a spacious home in the city, drove a luxury car, and had a spotless criminal record. But when detectives examined his bank statements, a strange pattern emerged. Over the last month, Daniel had withdrawn large amounts of cash in small, irregular increments, bypassing the usual electronic transactions he relied on. Security footage from several ATMs showed him glancing around nervously before pocketing the money. Even more curious were a series of late-night meetings captured on cameras in various parking lots across the city. The individuals he met with could not be identified, their faces obscured by hoods or the angle of the footage. None of these meetings were linked to his work or personal acquaintances. At the office, Daniel's coworkers noticed changes in his demeanor. Normally confident and composed, he had become distracted, often staring at his phone with a furrowed brow. Some recalled seeing him check the time repeatedly, as though he was anticipating something. Others mentioned he left early on several occasions without explanation, sometimes vanishing for hours during the day. When detectives questioned his family, his wife admitted he had been quieter than usual, spending long stretches in his study with the door closed. She assumed it was related to work stress, but in hindsight, she realized he had stopped discussing his daily activities altogether. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that Daniel was living a life split between two worlds, one his family and colleagues knew, and another shrouded in secrecy. Whatever had drawn him into Pine Hollow that day seemed tied to this hidden side, a side no one had known existed until his death. The break in the case came from an anonymous tip, a voice on the police hotline claiming that Daniel had been seen near an old property on the outskirts of Pine Hollow just days before his body was found. The address led detectives to a weathered, two-story house, long abandoned and partially hidden behind overgrown trees. Its windows were boarded, the paint peeled in strips, and the roof sagged under years of neglect. The front door was swollen from moisture and resisted every push until it gave way with a splintering crack. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mold. Faded wallpaper clung in patches to the walls, and the floor creaked under every step. Most of the rooms were empty, but a rusted staircase led down to a basement shrouded in darkness. At the bottom of the stairs sat a locked metal box on a wooden table, as if deliberately placed in plain sight. The brass key found in Daniel's pocket fit perfectly into its mechanism. The lock gave a heavy click, and the lid lifted to reveal an unsettling collection. Bundles of neatly stacked cash, old black and white photographs, and a folded scarf stained with what appeared to be dried blood. The photographs were unusual, grainy images of people standing in front of various rural locations, some decades old. None of the faces matched Daniel, but the settings were eerily remote. The scarf, once white, was stiff from age. A quick test confirmed the stain was human blood. DNA analysis brought an even stranger result. It belonged to a woman who was not in any police database. The basement offered no other clues, only a single bare bulb swinging overhead, casting long shadows. The sense was unmistakable. This house had been used for something secret, and possibly for a very long time. The DNA from the scarf puzzled investigators for weeks. It belonged to a woman with no criminal record, no identification, and no match in missing persons databases. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when an independent lab technician decided to run the sample against older, archived records. Buried deep in state archives was a match: Margaret Fields, a 29-year-old woman who had vanished without a trace in 1996. Margaret's disappearance had been a mystery in its own right. She was last seen leaving her workplace late one evening, her car later found abandoned by the side of a rural road. Despite exhaustive searches at the time, No body was recovered, and with no leads, the case went cold. Years later, she was declared legally dead. The idea that her DNA had turned up in connection with a murder nearly 3 decades later made no sense. Detectives contacted the original investigator from her case, now long retired. He confirmed that every lead had dried up within weeks of her disappearance. There had been no evidence she left the state, no sign of voluntary escape, and certainly no indication she had been alive all these years. The discovery raised troubling questions. If Margaret had died in the 1990s, how could her DNA appear fresh on a scarf locked away in a box connected to Daniel Cole? And if she had survived, where had she been all this time? And why had no one seen her? The possibility that she had somehow been involved in Daniel's death was unsettling. It suggested a connection between two people separated by decades, a connection no one could explain. The unanswered questions shifted the investigation into stranger territory, blurring the line between a straightforward homicide and something far more inexplicable. The reappearance of Margaret Fields in the evidence forced investigators to revisit a case long considered closed. One of the first steps was to confirm the original details of her disappearance. Records showed she had been buried in a small family plot after her legal death was declared, though her coffin had never been opened since the funeral. To rule out any possibility of a mistake, authorities obtained a court order to exhume her grave. The process took place under cold, gray skies, with only a handful of officials and forensic specialists present. As the casket was lifted from the earth and pried open, the truth became immediately clear: there was nothing inside. The coffin was empty, lined only with decaying fabric and dust. The absence of remains sent a ripple of disbelief through the gathered team. Police combed through the original case files again, searching for signs that something had been overlooked. The funeral records were inconsistent, with vague entries about the handling of the body and no photographs or witnesses to confirm her remains had ever been placed inside. Interviews with surviving relatives revealed that, at the time, they had been advised not to view the body because of its condition. The new revelation connected Margaret's disappearance to Daniel's death in a way that was impossible to ignore. It meant that either she had never died at all, or someone had gone to great lengths to stage her burial. Forensic teams expanded their search, re-examining storage units, abandoned properties, and other sites linked to cold cases from the mid-1990s. With every uncovered detail, the sense grew that Margaret's story was far from over, and that her presence in Daniel's life, decades later, was part of something much larger and far more disturbing than a coincidence. While cataloging the contents of the metal box from the abandoned house, one photograph stood out from the rest. Unlike the older, grainy images, this one appeared newer, printed on glossy paper. It showed a teenage boy, later confirmed to be a young Daniel Cole, standing beside a woman unmistakably identified as Margaret Fields. Both were smiling faintly, and behind them stood a small wooden cabin surrounded by dense forest. The photograph immediately raised impossible questions. Margaret had vanished in 1996, years before Daniel was even born. Yet forensic experts examined the image and concluded it had not been altered or forged. The lighting, shadows, and chemical composition of the print all indicated it was genuine. Detectives began searching for the cabin in the background. The landscape was nondescript, just trees, a dirt path, and the edge of a small clearing. But a faint number painted on the cabin's door, barely visible in the photo, offered a clue. Historical property records revealed a remote hunting cabin located nearly 20 miles from Pine Hollow, abandoned for decades and inaccessible except by narrow, overgrown trails. Even more disturbing was Daniel's appearance in the photograph. He looked exactly as he had in his high school records, no older, no younger, matching a time in his life when he would have been 16. Yet there were no known connections between him and Margaret, and no reason they could have met, let alone been photographed together. Investigators considered the possibility that the dates were wrong, but every check confirmed the timelines were accurate. The photograph seemed to defy the most basic logic, linking a man and a woman whose lives should never have intersected. Whatever had brought them together was tied to that cabin, and it was clear that finding it might be the key to the entire case. The search for the cabin was slow and painstaking. Dense undergrowth had swallowed the narrow trails, forcing investigators to cut their way through. After hours of navigating uneven ground, they finally emerged into a small clearing that matched the photograph exactly. The wooden structure stood weathered but intact, its roof bowed with age and its door hanging slightly ajar. Inside, dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung thick in the corners. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of wood rot. At first glance, the single room appeared empty except for a rusted stove and a broken chair. But as one detective swept a flashlight across the warped floorboards, he noticed a seam that didn't align with the others. Further inspection revealed a trapdoor hidden beneath a loose rug. The door groaned as it was pried open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air below was colder, carrying a faint metallic smell. At the bottom lay a cramped underground room, its walls lined with shelves cluttered with personal items, worn wallets, driver's licenses, jewelry, and scraps of clothing. Each item belonged to a missing person, some cases dating back over 40 years. In the center of the room sat a single chair, bolted to the concrete floor and secured with heavy chains. The sight was unsettling, suggesting the space had been used for confinement. Faded stains marked the floor around it, their origin left unspoken. There were no signs of recent activity, but the room's contents painted a chilling picture. Whoever had used this place had been operating in secret for decades, collecting trophies from victims and hiding them where no one would think to look. The discovery tied Daniel and Margaret to a history of disappearances and hinted at a darkness neither of them could have escaped. The evidence from the underground room forced investigators to re-examine the timeline of events. Among the recovered items were personal effects from victims spanning 4 decades, yet some of those individuals had last been seen only a few years earlier. That alone suggested that whoever was responsible had been active for an impossibly long time. Margaret Fields' name appeared in multiple witness statements collected over the years, but every account described her exactly the same, wearing a distinctive blue wool coat and looking no older than her late 20s. Local police records revealed that she had been sighted in towns across the state long after her supposed death, often near the times and locations of unexplained disappearances. In each case, witnesses insisted they remembered her face clearly, noting her pale skin, dark hair, and distant expression. Yet none of these reports had ever been connected, written off as coincidences or mistaken identity. Most unsettling was the connection to Daniel Cole. Several residents in his city reported seeing a woman matching Margaret's description visiting his home in the weeks before his death. She was always seen standing at a distance, never speaking to anyone, and disappearing before anyone could approach. One neighbor swore she saw the two together in Daniel's driveway late at night, though no security footage confirmed it. The idea that a woman who vanished in 1996 could appear unchanged nearly 3 decades later defied all logic. The working theory among some detectives was that Margaret had been involved in the disappearances linked to the underground room, and that Daniel had somehow become entangled in her path. Whether he sought her out or she found him remained unclear, but the pattern of sightings suggested their connection was neither recent nor accidental. It was something far older and far stranger. Forensic testing on the items recovered from the cabin revealed one final, unnerving detail. When Daniel Cole's DNA was compared to the samples taken from Margaret Fields, the results showed an unusual overlap, markers that went beyond the range of normal family relationships. They were not siblings, cousins, or even distant relatives. Instead, the genetic similarity was so precise that experts concluded they were effectively the same person at different points in a shared genetic sequence. The findings baffled the forensic team. The probability of 2 unrelated people sharing such an identical genetic profile was astronomically low, bordering on impossible. Further analysis confirmed there were subtle differences in the samples, as if separated by time or environmental changes, yet the core markers were indistinguishable. Detectives debated the meaning behind the results. One theory suggested some form of elaborate identity fraud or genetic manipulation, though there was no evidence of either. Another, far more unsettling possibility was that Daniel and Margaret were somehow linked in a way science could not yet explain, a connection that might involve time, altered records, or something entirely outside conventional understanding. The implications changed the direction of the case. If Daniel and Margaret were genetically identical, then their shared presence in the photographs and witness sightings was no coincidence. It also suggested that Daniel's secretive behavior in the weeks before his death may have been tied to discovering this connection himself. Whatever truth he uncovered, it was enough to cost him his life. And if Margaret truly was the same person in some altered form, then she had knowledge spanning decades, and a reason to keep that knowledge hidden. The brass key, the cabin, the underground room. Everything pointed to her as the central figure in a mystery that seemed to break the rules of reality itself. The official conclusion of the investigation offered little satisfaction. The final report listed the cause of Daniel Cole's death as homicide and named the suspect only as an unidentified female. No charges were filed, no arrests were made, and most of the physical evidence was sealed in storage by court order. The case file was closed to the public, leaving more questions than answers. Privately, however, members of the investigative team admitted they had never encountered anything like it. The DNA results, the decades of sightings, and the photograph of two people who should never have met suggested a reality that didn't fit within the boundaries of ordinary police work. Some detectives whispered that Daniel had stumbled upon something he was never meant to know, a truth that connected his life to Margaret Fields in ways impossible to explain. The last confirmed sighting of her came 2 weeks after Daniel's funeral. A security camera outside a rural gas station captured a woman in a blue wool coat stepping out of the woods at dusk. She glanced toward the camera for a brief moment before walking out of frame. Her face was unchanged from the 1996 missing persons photo, the same expression frozen in time. Pine Hollow slowly returned to its quiet routines, but the story lingered. Residents spoke of the case in hushed tones, warning strangers about the stretch of forest where Daniel's body had been found. Some claimed they saw a figure in blue watching from the tree line on foggy mornings, standing perfectly still until the mist swallowed her shape. No one could say for certain who Margaret Fields truly was, or what she had become. All that remained was the chilling sense that she was still out there, waiting, and that her story with Daniel Cole was far from over.